From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It's 2 years since the horrific events on October the 7th, when Hamas fighters attacked civilians at a music festival and Israeli families in their homes, killing more than 1,000 and taking more than 250 hostage. Today, as members of the Jewish community gather in Trafalgar Square to mark the anniversary of the tragedy, several pro-Palestinian protests will also be taking place. It follows protests on Saturday when 500 people were arrested in London, just days after the shocking terror attack on a synagogue in Manchester that left 2 dead and 3 still in hospital.
Jewish buildings, synagogues, even schools require round-the-clock protection because of the daily threat of anti-Semitic hatred.
Despite the government's pleas for protesters to respect the grief of British Jews, protests have continued.
I think it's important that as a Jewish person, I'm here today to show that there is no contradiction. In fact, there is a connection between being deeply concerned about the violence committed towards the congregation of Heaton Synagogue in Manchester and being concerned about the violence committed against the whole Palestinian population.
Is it bad taste or a sign of rising anti-Semitism that protests are being held today on the anniversary of one of the most horrifying attacks on Jews since the Holocaust? Should the government be restricting protests, or does that risk a fundamental democratic freedom? How do you protect the Jewish community in Britain while allowing legitimate debate about the war in Gaza? The Story today. Should pro-Palestinian protests be held on October the 7th?
It's a strange atmosphere, really. I went as close as I could to the synagogue on Sunday. Lots of flowers. The community is still in shock. There's lots of police officers and security officials from the Community Security Trust, the private group that protects Jewish communities.
That's Matt Dathan, Home Affairs editor for The Times, who's in Manchester for the Tory party conference. And while there, he went to see the synagogue where the terror attack unfolded last week.
It's a very traditional Jewish community. It seems like a million miles away from the city centre in a weird way. You know, I came back into city centre and there's pro-Palestine protests outside the Conservative Party conference. There's a permanent sort of vigil of candles to remember those killed in the Gaza war. So it's a strange atmosphere still.
And Matt, as you point out, despite the horrific attack in Manchester last week, the protests have continued. As Home Affairs editor, I mean, how much of your job right now is about protests of one sort or another?
Yes, so since October the 7th, protests have been a sort of permanent fixture of my job in terms of writing about the pro-Palestine protests, the balance of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, with the need to protect vulnerable communities. But actually, ever since I started this job as Home Affairs editor nearly 5 years ago, protests have been a very prominent part of what I cover, because back in 2021, we had all the Extinction Rebellion protests that sort of morphed into the Just Stop Oil protests. So protests and the right to protest and the right to balance that with the rights of people to feel safe have been a very prominent part of what I cover.
And we'll get into some of those other protests in a moment. But before we do, on the Gaza protests in particular, talk us through how they've built up, but also how successive governments have tried to deal with them.
Immediately after the October 7th attacks, you had protests organised in London every single Saturday And it was seen as very insensitive in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, given that almost 1,200 people had were killed in Israel and 251 hostages were taken. And then you also had Jewish groups coming out and protesting as well and holding vigils. So it was an incredibly tense time for weeks and weeks after October the 7th, 2023. And that sort of culminated in Suella Braverman, who was the then Home Secretary, writing an incendiary article for the Times, actually, which ultimately led to her being sacked. She accused the Metropolitan Police of bias in the way that it managed protests and said that they were treating the pro-Palestine protests much more softly than they did other protests, including far-right protests a few weeks previously.
Last summer, we saw many of the Southport rioters arrested, tried and sentenced in record time. The police responded incredibly proactively. But then contrast that with their approach to the pro-Hamas protesters, thousands of whom have taken to the streets on a regular basis for over a year to chant anti-Semitic slogans, to celebrate extremism and terrorism, while the police stand meekly by and do very little. A double standard, if ever there were one.
That then led to a huge backlash. The Home Secretary basically accusing the police of bias, wanting more operational control over police. Rishi Sunak sacked her, and that sort of dampened the immediate tension that we had between the government and police. James Cleverly then came in as Home Secretary, but he wasn't adverse to making his opinions known as well on these protests. And actually, yes, in February 2024, I was with him in America. We had regular protests every single weekend in London and other major cities. And by this point, a lot of Jewish communities really felt threatened and intimidated because they felt these pro-Palestine groups, the vast majority of whom are in these marches, are marching peacefully. And James Cleverly, as Home Secretary, in an interview I did with him, he said, look, you've made your point and now you're really intimidating and threatening Jewish communities, and that is out of order. That's what he said.
Policy on Gaza has changed over that period, and the protests have ramped up, and now they are clearly becoming a problem for the Labour government too. There was a moment where it felt like the protests weren't just about Palestine, but about democracy here in Britain. Just remind us how that's contributed to the protests.
Yes, I mean, it's important to remember here when we talk about pro-Palestine protests, there's an incredibly large number of groups who are holding events, holding rallies, holding protests, from the long-standing peaceful groups to the quite extremist groups that kind of hover around the fringes and have hijacked some of these protests to spread their hateful extremism with symbols celebrating the Hamas parachuters. And then you have the arguments over whether chants such as "From the river to the sea, let Palestine be free," whether that's anti-Semitic or not. So there's a lot of things involved with this, and that's what makes it so complicated and complex. Then you've had Palestine Action rear its head. Its main argument is, look, we won't be able to force the change that is needed, not just government policy, but stop British companies supplying Israel with weapons that they're using to kill people in Gaza, unless we take direct action. And that's sort of an echo of the direct action we saw environmental groups take. Elbit, the company Elbit, they are the main target, but they've also, as we know, targeted other arms companies and also the RAF base. And that really pushed the government over the line in announcing their intention to prescribe Palestine Action as a terror group back in July. And it's an incredibly controversial decision because being a terrorist group requires you to cross certain thresholds. Most important, I guess, in this case, is that you need to be furthering or being motivated by an ideology that would be termed as terrorist. So that's where we got to. July, then Home Secretary Yvette Cooper announced that Palestine Action would be treated alongside the likes of Al-Qaeda, Hamas and ISIS as a banned terror group.
And Matt, you started touching on the controversy there. I mean, just talk us through that, because for a lot of people in this country, there wasn't really enough evidence for Palestine Action to be treated as a terrorist group, to be prescribed as a terrorist group.
Yes, that's right. So not only need to be motivated by an ideology, that would need to lead to violence against people. The Home Office made the argument that it doesn't need to be just violence against people, but violence against property. And they have used incidents where certain individuals of Palestine Action have been violent against security guards at those companies, for example, to justify their decision. It's really controversial, as I said, because you're now treating them like Al-Qaeda or supporters of ISIS or Hamas. And that means that if you even support Palestine Action, you can face jail time, up to 14 years in jail, actually. And then we've seen more than 1,700 people. I mean, actually, since Saturday's protests, that's taken us over the 2,000 mark of arrests of people who have deliberately gone out in protest against the decision by the government to prescribe Palestine Action. So many of these people have been the last people you would ever describe as terrorists in your mind, I guess. Pensioners coming out, sitting peacefully, saying, I support Palestine Action. And what we've actually seen is, through the interviews that we've seen with some of these people arrested, they've said, actually, I didn't actually support Palestine Action before the government prescribed them, but I disagree with the government's decision to prescribe what I see as a protest group.
It is really difficult, isn't it? Because a lot of the characteristics of Palestine Action, as much as the government has made public, do match what most traditional protest groups would do. You know, the random acts of sabotage, damage to bits of property, but not terror as most of us would recognise it. So some of these protests have become about democracy themselves. Why do you think successive governments now have seen these protests as such a problem?
I think there's a lot of pressure on Palestine Action because they saw that they were becoming increasingly emboldened and causing so much disruption that it was really harming legitimate businesses. And I think they believed that if we don't do something, then they're just going to keep on gathering momentum, gathering support, and people will think that because we aren't taking action, their destruction, their direct action against businesses and causing all this damage will be legitimised and justified. And it's obviously been hard for the police to intervene because then they look like they're trying to shut down protests, which is our fundamental right to express and assemble. But then, quite legitimately, some senior figures in the Jewish community are saying, if you are allowing marches to go ahead where people are flying flags celebrating Hamas, who are a prescribed terror group in this country, then you are also legitimising that behaviour.
Matt, the whole debate around the protests took on a new dimension after the attack in Manchester last week. Protests did go ahead on the day and over the weekend. We're now expecting protests today on the second anniversary of October the 7th, the horrific attack on Israelis that sparked the war. Tell us what we can expect to see today.
So today, 2 years on from that horrifying terror attack on Israel, where almost 1,200 people were killed, 251 hostages were taken, we will see across the UK commemorative events being held by Jewish groups, Trafalgar Square, for example, in Manchester. But what we're also going to see is across university campuses, a whole range of events, from film and discussion nights to rallies to an inter-university march between 4 universities in London, marking the 2-year anniversary of October the 7th. And now these aren't Jewish groups holding these events. These are pro-Palestine groups, ranging from, the Sheffield Communists, for example, at Sheffield University, to Palestine for Justice group at Strathclyde University, for example. And some of them quite legitimately holding peaceful events. But there are some that are really quite incendiary. Goldsmiths, for example, posters are advertising a night of remembrance and resistance, suggesting, those who carried out the attacks were justified. At King's College London, an event saying why it didn't start on October 7th. There's similar events at Edinburgh University, Queen's Mary, Bristol University, etc., etc. So it's going to be really quite tense, and let's hope that we don't see any violence, but Jewish student groups are very worried.
One of the universities where pro-Palestinian protests will be taking place today is University College London. We spoke to a member of the faculty there.
My name is Brad Blitz. I'm a professor of international politics and policy at UCL. I'm also the parent of a Jewish student at UCL.
Brad, we know that UCL is going to be part of the protests taking place on the second anniversary of October the 7th. How do you feel about that?
I'm horrified because the truth is that students have been subject to aggression, microaggressions, bullying, name-calling, intimidation for 2 years now. And it just carries on.
And can you give us some examples of the sort of behaviour that the students you've spoken to have experienced, including your own child?
So there are many ways in which students are affected. broadly, I would say it falls within the realm of bullying and harassment. And that is, students are subject to name calling. They are isolated from other students as a result of it. There's gossip bullying that goes on. There's shouting and abuse, which is actually projected at them. And we know the slogans. We know that there are groups out there that seek to demonize not just those with a connection to Israel, but Jewish students as well. And in some cases, it's also resulted in criminal acts that have been reported to the police, I'm told. So one student, for example, sent around a social media post in which he wrote -2 under the Israeli diplomats that had been slain in Washington, D.C., as if to say, okay, 2 down, there's more to come. Another student was doxxed, and that is, she simply was filmed. She had a yellow ribbon on her, and the online abuser welcomed information about her background, where she lived, what she did. And it's a very worrying and intimidating environment that has been created.
I suppose it's really difficult for the university because it's supposed to foster an environment of free speech. For you, as an academic, I mean, how difficult is it to work out at what point protests become a real problem and at what point they've got to be allowed?
Let me just say, you can't enjoy the right to free speech when you're faced with bullies that are shouting you down and interrupting you and disrupting events. And that's the situation that we have here. And I would say that's commonplace across the sector. At other universities, there are reports of very similar sort of events. And the so-called other side, if you like, the pro-Palestine protesters, don't wish to engage in dialogue. They don't want to see free speech protected and promoted. They only want to impose their view on others, including by, symbolic violence, shouting down, calling people names, interrupting, disrupting events. That's the sort of behavior that we've seen, and it's simply not acceptable at university, and it undermines the educational experience for everyone.
We tried to speak to some of the students who'll be taking part in protests today, but we didn't hear back from them in time. But Matt, our Home Affairs editor, has been hearing from them.
They say that they have the right to protest. A lot of them will share their solidarity and disgust at the attack on Thursday that led to the 2 Jews being killed. But they also say that we have the right to stand up and protest against the Israeli government's actions in Palestine. And the odd thing is really that both sides argue that the events are isolated and totally separate. We can protest against the Israeli government at the same time as being disgusted and sharing solidarity with an isolated terror attack in Manchester. The Jewish community would argue a lot of Jews here in the UK are disgusted at the Israeli government's actions or certain actions that are taken out. And you can't blame Jews across the world for the actions of one government. And you've had an alarm from civil liberty groups who've expressed concern at this renewed call for protests to be banned. And they're saying this will go against our fundamental rights in this country for freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. And there's a real difference between taking part in peaceful protests and those groups who are expressing hateful extremism that is inciting hatred towards Jews.
Matt, you're talking to us from Manchester about the protests that are taking place across the country today. Given where you are, how much fear is there that there is a rising tide of anti-Semitism in Britain at the moment? And how is the government talking about trying to address it?
On your first question, I don't think we can underestimate the levels of fear amongst Jewish communities. And that has been really hammered through to me, having reported on many different angles to this since October the 7th, but having spoken to people since Thursday's attack. And I went up to, as I said, to the synagogue where the attack unfolded with members of the Conservative Party and also family members who are also Jewish of mine. And they said they've never felt levels of fear on this level since they've been born. And actually, I was looking through the statistics that the Community Security Trust carries out. And in every single month since the October 7th attacks 2 years ago, they've recorded over 200 anti-Semitic incidents every single month. Previously, that had only happened on 5 occasions since 1984 when they were set up. So that just shows you the levels of anti-Semitism in this country since October the 7th. And a very good friend of mine, a Jewish man, he said that he is genuinely thinking of leaving the UK because of anti-Semitism in the UK. And he was born on the same street as I was. And to me, that is the most saddening thing of all of this, is that people are actually thinking of leaving the country because of levels of anti-Semitism.
And that's not a one-off. We are hearing that people are leaving. They're moving to Israel because it feels safer. Is there anything that the Jewish community would like the government to do to try and stop the anti-Semitism? Beyond the protests, just the anti-Semitism.
Yeah, there's one thing, which is shoring up security outside synagogues and in Jewish communities. And the government has, back in February, they announced £70 million for the CST. Since Thursday, they've announced extra police patrols, etc. But the very truth of it is that there's only so much security you can do, really, to protect synagogues and Jewish communities, because the attacker last week used his car to ram into the security gates and then started stabbing people. And so it's these sort of lone wolf attacks that we've seen other Islamic extremists carry out. So it's not just security, but it's about how do we fundamentally tackle the root causes of anti-Semitism. There's lots to be discussed, a lot of people talking about how we need to do more, but very few people offering the solutions. But one person who I think has offered a real plausible solution is Sarah Khan, who is the government's former counter-extremism advisor, and also the social cohesion advisor. And she's written in the Times this week about the need for the government to set up a specific unit that actively, proactively goes out and counteracts the narratives and the conspiracy theories that are inciting extremists, that are setting in the radicalized views to almost become normalized. Tom Tugendhat, the former security minister, he said something which was really interesting, and an angle to this that I hadn't really thought about before, which is extra police powers to shut down protests or to intervene when there's hateful extremism, etc., is not just needed in order to punish people who are extremists, but they also need to be used because he said that a lot of Muslim families have complained to him of the lack of government action is leading to their own children. So the Muslim parents, their children are watching a lot of these rallies from their bedrooms, watching a lot of the chants. And because they see them operating with impunity without any police intervention and any consequence, they are thinking, well, this is normal, this is allowed, this is justified. And that is radicalizing them without them realizing it. And they're then sharing memes, they're sharing narratives, conspiracy theories, because they don't realize themselves that it's not normal. And what Tom Tugendhat said is that the Muslim parents he's spoken to is, why is it okay for our children to be radicalized, but not yours? And that's quite another striking comment that made me think we're not treating different forms of extremism fairly in the UK.
That's so interesting. We don't know what the government is going to do on the anti-Semitism front. We know they are thinking of doing something about the protests, and we should, again, just try and decouple them because we don't know for sure that the protests are leading to the anti-Semitism or whether it's happening online or where it's happening. And we know that many of the people who attend the protests aren't anti-Semitic. We should just sort of state that again. But the government is trying to do something to try and restrain some of the protests. Just tell us what Shabnam Mahmood, the Home Secretary, is proposing.
Yeah, so after the Thursday attack, there was calls for the government to give police more police powers. Lord Wolney, who's the government's advisor on political violence until he stepped down earlier this year, he reminded the government that he had written a big report on this very issue and the need to give police more powers to intervene in these protests, of which both the Conservative and the Labour government had pretty much ignored, actually. And Shabnam Mahmood on Sunday came out and announced that she was taking forward one of his proposals, which was to give police the power to restrict protests that had a cumulative impact on the local community. So basically repeat protests, if that is having a growing impact on the local community or local businesses, etc., then the police would be able to apply restrictions on it to say you can't carry out this protest in this area. Now, it's quite limited because the police would still need to argue that the protest would likely cause serious disruption. And Lord Walney has asked them to go much further, such as taking out the need for serious disruption to be caused, just a cumulative impact of these pro-Palestine protests, say every Saturday down Whitehall or wherever it might be, city centres, should be restricted, and the police should be able to say, yes, you can take part, you can hold a rally, but you can't hold it in its area because it needs a bit of breathing space, for example. Lord Walney has also asked the government to implement his recommendation to allow police forces to consider their own resources before allowing a protest to go ahead. So but if the police forces has been overstretched because of competing demands, such as far-right protests, counter-protests from Jewish groups, pro-Palestine groups, maybe there's been lots of football matches in the local area, or as you say, there might be Palestine Action protests which require them to make arrests, then they can say, look, on this particular day, we don't have the resources to police your march and protect you, because there are often counter-protests that put them at risk. So therefore, you need to rearrange for another day. That's what he wants. He also wants them to allow the police to ban protests when there are face coverings, for example, which often protect their identity. So, yeah, there's a lot more scope for Shabnam to consider. And she said she will carry out an almost root and branch review of protest legislation and consider if they do need to go further. And in that, she will consider giving police the right to ban protests outright.
How do the police feel about these potential changes?
It's a very sensitive issue for them because the more powers they have, the more criticism they get. And also, the more powers they get to intervene in protests, the more political that decision becomes, because you're then making a decision of whether to shut down a far-right protest, shut down a pro-Palestine protest, and you'll be criticised for whatever decision you make. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And police are always very careful about making any kind of political decisions. And they say, look, it's for the government to decide on what powers we need. But at the same time, Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, he himself has said that the police need to have more powers given to them if the public and the government really want them to intervene in these kind of protests. And he wrote a report alongside Sarah Khan, who I mentioned earlier, back in 2021, calling for the government to bring in new legislation that would criminalise hateful extremism, because they argued that a lot of groups on the far right, but also Islamic extremists, are deliberately operating just below the threshold of terrorism in expressing hateful extremist views in the knowledge that the police will not be able to do anything against them. So Mark Rowley's sort of taken the view that you need a broader approach to the whole legal framework. It's not just about giving police extra police powers.
For the police, has the fact that they've had to make hundreds and hundreds of arrests linked to Palestine Action, which, as you say, are often grannies and vicars and pillars of the community who are really angry that it's not possible to protest about what's happening in Palestine without what looks like a protest group being prescribed as a terror organisation. So they're just as angry about what's happening to democracy here, I suppose. Has that been a distraction from being able to arrest people who are being overtly anti-Semitic around protests?
It's certainly a distraction from the police's other priorities. Having to make more than 500 arrests on Saturday for, as you say, a lot of people who are elderly pensioners sitting in Trafalgar Square and Parliament Square with signs saying they support Palestine Action is certainly not the kind of police resources that the likes of Mark Rowley want to be doing, I don't think. But obviously they have to carry out the will of Parliament and the will of the government. I think it will come to a head in November with the judicial review against that decision to prescribe Palestine Action. I think there is some signs of regret amongst some ministers and officials in government that they did prescribe Palestine Action, because it's actually, as we said earlier, attracted even more support for them. So certainly they are being distracted, and not just from the task of rooting out criminal anti-Semitic slurs and behaviour, but also from other crime as well.
And Matt, stepping back from the Gaza issue in particular, we mentioned earlier that protests have ramped up across the board over the last few years, and so have the actions of governments to try to restrict them, to try to rein them in. This feels like the latest step in what is a direction of travel, really, and that alone will alarm a lot of people in this country. They'll feel that this is a restriction on the democratic right to protest. Just talk us through how that change has happened over the last few years and the last few governments.
The Extinction Rebellion protests and the Just Stop Oil protests really started government thinking about how to strengthen protest powers. Most of our protest legislation is in the 1986 Public Order Act, so that tells you just how I guess, old and outdated the protest legislation is. So back in 2020, Priti Patel, the then Home Secretary, started introducing legislation that would clamp down on environmental groups. But it seems like a bit of a whack-a-mole approach, because back then it was more banning people from bringing bike locks or glue to protests, because you saw environmental protesters gluing themselves to buildings or to each other, when you actually had those protesters who stripped off naked in the House of Commons in the public gallery and glued themselves to the screen. That's certainly an image that I'm going to get out of my head. And you had them locking themselves to the gates of Parliament.
Fathers for Justice turning up on the roof of Parliament and abseiling down.
Yes, yeah, and Just Up Oil would block M25, for example, and so then the government came forward with new powers that would criminalise people who blocked public highways. Then you had the pro-Palestine protests, and the government yet again came forward with legislation to start clamping down on anything that caused serious disruption. There was also the quite ridiculous provision to try and prevent noisy protests. Now, the very essence of protesting is often to cause disruption. So I think what the government has done is a very piecemeal patchwork effort that has actually caused more criticism and mockery than it has actually fixed the problem. And I think what Shabnam Mood is trying to do is, through her review, is to take a more holistic approach and think, how do we treat this whole issue of protests and balance it against the right to the freedom of expression, the freedom to assemble, rather than just every time a new group crops up, you go, oh, we'll ban them, we'll ban that action, we'll ban bike locks, ban glue, etc.
That was Matt Dathan, Home Affairs Editor at The Times, and earlier, Professor Brad Blitz from UCL. The producers today were Shabnam Grewal and Micaela Arneson. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.